Afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the country. And thank you so much, Simone. I just want to start by naming three things. I think the first is to just acknowledge that we're living in a moment of disruption right now. And it's specifically disruption to the work that not only we do, but that we deeply care about. And so each of us and each of our organizations likely is entering this webinar today with very different experiences with that disruption. And we just want to hold that. I think the second thing I want to name is that the topic of resilience and sustainability is a really big topic. So I just want to acknowledge we're going to scratch the surface today, but we're also going to ask you at the end of this webinar to share your thoughts about what else would be helpful. And then the third thing is just to name, as you can probably see from the chat and folks' introductions, that we have a wide variety of organizations joining us here today. We have nonprofits of all missions and sizes. We have funders and consultants. And so as a result, we're going to share some different types of examples as we go through the presentation. And we expect that some will resonate for you. And you'll say, yeah, that organization is just like mine. And some may not, because we are speaking to a very diverse audience. So just please recognize that as well. So with that, I am going to start off by just defining a few words that I'm going to be using kind of frequently throughout this presentation. And I'm just going to give the screen a moment to come up here. Excellent. So we're going to talk about survival, resilience, and sustainability. Survival is really about maintaining short-term operations. It's about getting by, and I'm sure it's not the place that many of us like to be, but sometimes that is the place that we're at. Resilience is really about being able to adapt and recover from shocks, disruptions, crises. And sustainability is really about the ability to continue to deliver long-term impact day in and day out. So how to get more money is often the first thing that comes to mind when we think about increasing resilience and sustainability. Money is an important part of the equation, and I would argue that it isn't sufficient. I think what we've learned through our experience here at Community Wealth Partners is that building an organization's resilience and sustainability requires intentionality around all the components that you see here on your screen. And really thinking strategically about how they're working together to help you to respond and adapt to changes in your environment, and also how they're working together to help you deliver impact. When you registered for this webinar, you may recall that we asked you a question. We asked you what concerns you the most as you consider your organization's resiliency. And interestingly, your concerns, for the most part, focused in on these three components in the center. That is, the majority of your comments were about strategy, economics or money, and organizational capacity. So we heard concerns about the external environment is shifting. We're having to rethink our strategy. We're having to shift priorities and language. We're having to figure out how to address new needs that are emerging among the populations that we work with. We heard concerns about economic viability and specifically around funding uncertainty and cash flow uncertainty. And finally, we heard concerns about the strain on people and infrastructure. We heard real worries about burnout of staff and the ability of leadership to respond and adapt to the moment. Today, we are going to share 4 disciplines or consistent practices that we found can help leaders navigate these types of concerns and feel like they're turning a corner. These disciplines come from our nearly 30 years of experience at Community Wealth Partners, working with hundreds of nonprofits across the country. And honestly, they also come from my personal experience leading an organization. We're going to go through each of these disciplines in more depth, but briefly, let me just state what each one is about. So visibility is about having clear information that helps you understand your current state and truly what is changing. Predictability is about building systems to forecast what might happen so you can plan and prepare. Decision making is about creating the space, the repetitive structures, and the thought partners needed to step back, reflect, and make sound decisions. And seeding is about making small incremental investments of money or time into building a more resilient and sustainable future for your organization. So let's start with visibility. Visibility is about trying to see what is ahead. It's about having clear information that helps you understand the current state, both in your external environment, but also inside your organization and what might be changing. This is important because when you have good information, you can make more informed decisions. And personally, I've also found that when I have good information, I can be more transparent as a leader in sharing with staff what the current state is, and I can engender more trust with staff, board, and other stakeholders. So let me just share two examples of organizations that have navigated kind of visibility challenges and the ways they've pivoted to address those. Last year, when the One Big Beautiful Bill went into effect, refugees, asylum seekers, and other humanitarian immigrants immediately lost SNAP benefits. And I'm sure many of you who work in this area are well aware of this. A regional food bank was faced with the challenge of figuring out how to reach these individuals. They turned to publicly available data to understand where the greatest concentration of refugees lived in their community, and they also started calling refugee-serving organizations to understand kind of the bandwidth and capacity at those organizations to distribute more food. I happen to sit on, one more thing. What they ultimately did is they triangulated kind of these various pieces of data that they had gathered through secondary research on the internet, pulling publicly available information, and kind of through the phone calls that they had done. And they made strategic choices about where they were going to put more food in order to reach this population, recognizing that they couldn't just put it everywhere. And I happen to sit on the board of this organization, which is the Capital Area Food Bank here in the DC area for many years. And I can tell you that over the last 7 or 8 years, they have intentionally built this discipline of seeking out and using data to respond to shifts in demand for food. So now it's not something that they have to work real hard at. It actually is more their way of being. And so hence why we are calling these disciplines, because I think these are not one-time things, but actually consistent practices that need to be exercised. For my second example, I'll just talk about increasing visibility inside your organization. We've worked with a number of community-based organizations that are at that stage in their development where they don't have a lot of financial infrastructure inside their organizations. And they've been faced with the challenge of understanding their cash flow. You know, how much money really is going to come in the door over the next many months? How much money really is going to go out the door in the next many months? And when might our cash levels dip dangerously low? And to address this, we've seen organizations do a variety of things. They've sought out pro bono support. They've hired an outsourced fractional finance professional. Because again, many of these organizations have been those that are not yet at the place of being able to hire a full-time CFO or a full-time financial professional. Or they've leaned on board members to help them pull together the information they need and create tools and instill practices that can help them track their cash flow on a regular basis. So I've shared those two examples, one really looking at kind of gathering information about your external environment and what's changing. One is more around internally what's happening. And I just want to say about both of those that again, the key is to establish a regular discipline of asking yourself, what's the data I need and how do I get it? And keep in mind, you don't have to have significant data analytics capabilities or significant data already in-house to do this. There is so much publicly available information. So I'm going to pause for a minute and invite you to reflect on the two questions that you see in the yellow post-it on your screen. Where do you need more information to make decisions? Think about your own organization. And where might you find this information and who can help you get it? I'm just going to pause for a moment before we move on to the next discipline and ask you to reflect. And if you're so inclined, please share in the chat, maybe just your response to the first question. Where do you feel like you need more information to make decisions? By sharing in the chat, you're allowing others that are in this webinar to kind of benefit from your comments. So I encourage those who are willing to do so. There's also no pressure. Okay. Feel free to keep reflecting and putting comments in the chat, and we'll go ahead and move on. So the next discipline we're going to talk about is predictability, which is about knowing more about what is ahead. Maybe not knowing everything, but knowing more about what is ahead. So predictability is about using the information you've gathered and building systems to forecast what might happen. This is basically about making your best guesses about what's about to occur and then allowing yourself or enabling yourself to prepare and plan for what's coming. I think for me personally, this is really important. When I personally, as a leader, have had a sense of what might happen, and then I can think about how I might respond should that thing actually happen, it helps me feel more steady and grounded. And honestly, it also helps me, I think, come across more calm in my interactions and in my communications with staff and board and others. And obviously, it helps all of us as leaders make more informed and timely decisions. Let me just share again two brief examples. So we've worked with organizations that have been heavily reliant on a few institutional funders, and perhaps that statement resonates with you. Perhaps you feel like you are heavily reliant on just a few funders or donors. And these organizations have worried about whether those funders will actually renew their grants and continue to invest in them when the grant cycle is over. So to address this, several of these organizations have tried to get more visibility, which we just talked about, by directly asking their funders about their intentions. Or in some cases, when funders have been less inclined to share direct intentions, I would say another strategy is to ask about what's happening inside those foundations that might influence the probability of you getting another grant. For example, are they working on a new strategy? Which sometimes when an organization creates a new strategy, their priorities do change. I think from there, these organizations have been able to build tools, whether simple ones in Excel or whether through systems they already have, like Salesforce, to track the probability of various grant renewals, basically making educated guesses about the likelihood of each one being renewed. This has helped them better predict what their revenue situation will be going forward. So you basically are creating a tool that helps you have a revenue pipeline, and you are consistently able then to update it so that you have a better sense at all times of what your future revenue might look like. For my second example, I'm going to focus on people. We saw a lot of comments in the registrations about concerns around staff and burnout and people. So when you're worried about staff burnout or potentially even staff leaving, the first step is gaining visibility into where your folks' heads are at by asking direct questions. For example, in our own organization, we have a set of 5 check-in questions that we ask all supervisors to use at the beginning of their check-ins with supervisees. These questions are about the well-being of staff and generally how they're feeling about work. This information can then be used by supervisors to inform how they might respond, what they might do to address the issues before they become even bigger issues, or to think about who's at risk of leaving and where the organization might need to cross-train some staff because potentially there's a risk of you losing certain skills or capabilities that are critical to doing your work. I think what I have found is that too often inside organizations, check-ins between supervisors and supervisees aren't super intentional. And as a result, really important information is not exchanged. And yet there is an opportunity to put a structure and a discipline in place that allows you to capture really critical information. It helps organizations better respond to their people, but also predict what might happen with their people going forward, so they can prepare for it. So with that, I am going to pause again to invite you to reflect on the reflection questions. What feels most unpredictable to you right now? Where would you like a greater sense of control? And how can you create more predictability in these areas? You may not have the answers to the third question today, but even what's a step you could take to start to create more predictability in the areas where you feel like there's a lot of uncertainty? Again, I'm going to pause for a moment and just allow you to reflect, jot down some thoughts, and invite you to share in the chat perhaps an area where you see possibilities to create greater predictability inside your organization. If you do see areas where you might be able to make some progress on creating greater predictability, please share. And again, this is really for the benefit of the other webinar participants so that you all can see each other's thoughts and ideas. And I do see some of the responses that are in the chat that came perhaps from visibility and also those that you may be entering right now into predictability. Keep putting those in the chat again for the benefit of others that are on this webinar. And we're going to go ahead and move on. So now's the point where we get to rest. Perhaps not all of you will view this as a rest moment, but we're going to talk about decision making. So decision making really is about pausing to reflect on the information you've gathered and the forecasts you've created, and then making decisions and taking action. Decision making, as you can imagine, is where the rubber meets the road. It's about creating space to reflect and make sense of information. It's also about having a repetitive structure, and I'll say more about what I mean by that in a moment, but having a repetitive structure that is used for decision making, like a monthly team meeting or a monthly executive team meeting. It's about making sure also that you have the right thought partners at the table to support you. As leaders, we can't do this alone. And guess what? As leaders, we often kind of fly at a higher altitude and we don't get to see everything on the ground. So sometimes it's really critical to have other thought partners at the table to make sure that we're making sound decisions. This is important because it can help you move from being reactive to more proactive and intentional. It can also create space for more generative thinking and for new ideas to emerge. And it can also decrease that feeling that we all have at moments, a feeling like we're running to solve everything. And then we get burned out, which isn't good for us personally. It's not good for our organizations and our staff, and it's not good for our missions. I will just share on a personal note that when I have a big decision to make, it can weigh on me. And perhaps you've experienced this. You wake up in the middle of the night, you're thinking about it, and honestly, it can exhaust me. And so the way I figured out how to alleviate this is to make sure I have a plan for making the decision. I figure out, when am I going to make the decision? What meeting am I going to make that decision at? And who do I need to help me? And let me make sure that they're available to be there with me to make it. So I want to share a bit about what we see inside organizations as it relates to decision making. I think the challenges we've witnessed are varied. I would say in some very large organizations, we've seen that there are executive teams, and they may actually have regularly scheduled meetings, but meeting after meeting after meeting, decisions don't get made. And what we often find is that in those organizations, sometimes executive team members are very siloed and their work is very siloed. Nobody is holding the big picture of the organization, or they as a collective aren't holding the big picture of the organization. And they don't really have an approach for making decisions together or the muscle to make decisions together. And then we see in some smaller community-based organizations a situation where there's maybe one executive and most of the decision making falls on that one executive's shoulders. That individual is often being pulled in a million directions and a lot of demands on their time without the space to really step back and reflect and to make decisions. So, depending on whatever situation you're in, whether one of the ones I just described or a totally different one, perhaps, I think there are a variety of ways to address this. I think one is about creating a repetitive structure. So in culture change work that we do, one of the keys to changing culture is to put a structure in place that forces the behavior change that you want. And so in this case, that structure might be the monthly executive team meeting, or it might be if it's not an executive team, just a monthly meeting where you're able to call in a couple of thought partners to help make decisions. It might be about making a decision-making protocol, outlining how are we going to make decisions together. Or if you're more of a solo decision maker, like I described, sometimes it's about holding time on your calendar and protecting that time so that you can create the space for yourself to pause, to think, to look at data, and to make sound decisions. And I would really encourage you, especially if you are in that situation where you're more of a solo decision maker in your organization, to seek out thought partners. Those thought partners don't necessarily have to be inside your organization, although they could be other staff people, but they could also be a board member, a peer CEO in another organization. There's a lot of different places that you can look for good thought partners. So with that, I'm going to pause and just invite you to reflect on these reflection questions. What structures do you need to put in place to create the space that I've just described, this space for sense making and decision making if it doesn't already exist inside your organization? What feels most strategic to reflect on? And who are your go-to thought partners? Now, for different decisions, you might have different thought partners, but you might also have, I once talked to an executive director who said, I have my guru list. And so maybe you have a guru list of 2 or 3 people that you regularly want to lean on to be your thought partners in making decisions. I also just want to call out, as I've been going through these reflection questions, I'm obviously very much speaking to those of you who are nonprofits. If you're a funder and you're in this conversation, or if you're a consultant and you're in this conversation, feel free to also reflect on the organizations that you fund or that you work with. And feel free to share in the chat, any of you, whether nonprofit funder or consultant, feel free to share in the chat, perhaps an area where you feel like decision-making could be improved in your organization, or how decision-making might be able to be improved in your organization. And I'm just going to pause for a moment and let you reflect. Feel free to share a thought in the chat about how decision-making might be able to be improved in your organization. Okay, so let's move on to the 4th discipline. So finally, we'll talk about the concept of seeding. This is about fueling up for the future journey, because this moment of disruption, we know, the one that we're living in now, it won't be the last. So seeding is about starting to put the seeds down now by making small, incremental investments of money or time to build whatever it is that you need to build to be more resilient and sustainable in the future. And for every organization, what you need to build to be more sustainable and resilient in the future is going to be probably something different. This is important because many of the capacities that we need to create in order to be more resilient or sustainable, they take years to build. No capacity is built in an organization overnight. So whether this be we need to build financial reserves, we need to build more diversified revenue streams, we need to build our financial infrastructure or our talent and human resources infrastructure. We need to build our capability to use AI to make our service delivery more efficient. The list goes on and on. For every one of you, like I said, it might be something different. But the benefits of ongoing small investments can compound over time. We've seen this again and again. And so if you start now, you put yourself in a better position to weather future storms and disruptions. So I want to share one example of this from our parent organization, Share Our Strength. Some of you may know our organization, Community Wealth Partners, is owned by a nonprofit called Share Our Strength. More than a decade ago, its revenues had plateaued, and it knew it needed to diversify its revenue streams. And then in 2012, the organization unexpectedly received a planned gift of $2,000. And many of you may be familiar with planned gifts. For those who are not, a planned gift is when somebody writes you into their will as a beneficiary, not you personally, but your organization into their will as a beneficiary, or you become the beneficiary of their trust, or some other kind of financial mechanism that they have. So the organization in 2012 received this planned gift. They'd never received one before for $2,000, and a light bulb went off. And in the years that followed, they began to make small incremental investments in developing a planned giving program, hiring a consultant to give them advice, kind of naming one of their fundraising staff people to be the person who spends a couple hours of their time per week on exploring this. Eventually, they put up a page on their website that explained how people could give them a planned gift. And then eventually, they actually started to do email blasts out to their network and the donors and others that they had relationships with to let them know that planned giving was an option. In 2017, about 5 years after that first $2,000 planned gift that they unexpectedly received, they started to see revenue come in from planned giving. They received $170,000 in that year from planned giving. Fast forward to date, they've received $3.8 million in revenue through planned gifts, and they currently have a $15 million pipeline of gifts that they expect to receive in the years to come. So small investments over a long period of time to build this revenue stream into something that was more meaningful and substantial. So I'm going to pause and ask you to reflect on the question that you see on your screen. What small investment can you make now that could have a big impact on your organization 5 to 10 years from now, assuming that you continue to make small investments in it? So what small investment can you make now that could have a big impact on your organization 5 to 10 years from now? And I mean small. This doesn't have to be a lot of money or a lot of time, but you have to start somewhere. Feel free to share in the chat what your reaction is to that question. If you have a thought about a small investment you could start making now, again, for the benefit of others, I see them coming in. Endowment, construction fund, planned giving. Excellent. So what are the areas where you want to think about making some small investments? If you're a funder again or a consultant, maybe you think about some of your grantees or your clients, and where do you see opportunities for them? Just take a minute. And I do see small investment in professional development in your people. Absolutely. Thank you, Latoya. So I see other comments coming in, and I encourage you to keep reflecting on that. So if we can just go to the next slide. I'm just going to summarize the road we've been down here. So we've talked about four disciplines. Increase visibility by gathering the information you need. Work to increase predictability inside your organization by making informed guesses about what might happen and start to prepare for those realities. And then take that information and take those informed guesses that you have and make decisions and take action. Ensure you have repetitive structures and protocols and thought partners to help you make timely, informed decisions. And then always be planting seeds for the future by making small investments now that may not pay off until years from now. The key here is to practice these disciplines consistently. These are not things that you just do once and then don't do again. And the key here is systems and structures which help drive behavior change inside your organization. The other key is to think about these disciplines and apply them across all aspects of your organization, from your finance, your programs, your marketing and communications, your, staff and team, all of those areas, because these really are evergreen disciplines that can be applied broadly. So those are the four disciplines, and I'm now going to turn it back to Simone because we purposely wanted to leave lots of time for questions today, as we know that you come here for a reason, usually with a set of questions in your head.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. The four disciplines: visibility, predictability, decision-making, and seeding. Um, there's some great engagement, Amy. I know you've been looking in the chat. There's some really great engagement. We encourage you all to share your questions in the Q&A box. If it's easier to add your questions to the chat, please feel free to do that. We're now entering into our Q&A portion of the webinar. I'm going to bring on our colleagues, Amy Farley and Carla Taylor, who you've been talking to throughout this session, and now you get to put a face to a name. Welcome, Carla and Amy. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, just to kind of kick off this portion, you've been engaging in the comments. I'm curious to hear, where's the conversation going? What's standing out? Carla, do you want to go first?
Well, my eye went to the comment about managers and the rule of thirds, so thank you to Pratishi for that. My role here at the firm has a lot to do with talent and people, so my eyes and ears are always attuned to what does it mean to build a supportive culture and supportive workplace for people. I think we also know that in the lead up to this, we heard a lot about staff burnout. That's everywhere in the sector right now. And so this piece about how supervisors can be paying attention to what's happening, not just with the work or tasks, but with the people that they're supporting is huge. And it also makes me think about some of the other things, Simone, that we've either heard, seen, or tried. So this idea of building cultures that don't reinforce, superhero behaviors. Is your work human-centered? Are you creating realistic expectations? Are you checking in with folks about workload? And then I think about what are the low-cost ways to really make sure that we're staying ahead of where folks are, staying in tune with what they need. And it's little things, like Amy mentioned this, a pulse survey, just checking in. There's no substitute for asking people where they are, what they want, what they need. And then it doesn't have to be a big program or policy rollout. You can pilot a thing. So you can try a thing for a short amount of time. And I just feel like we've seen so much value from folks who were willing to listen and then willing to pilot and then potentially willing to pivot. So when you ask someone, what am I hearing and what am I seeing, both from the earlier survey and then in this conversation about the supervisor role, my eye goes to how do we take care of our people? So that's some of the things that are standing out to me and that I've been hearing and thinking about myself recently.
That's awesome. I love that. Try a thing. If you heard that, put it in the chat. Try a thing. Amy, what are you hearing?
Well, I just noticed that a new Q&A that someone dropped in asking if these four disciplines can apply to and be scaled down and right sized to think about teams, programs, departments. And I just wanted to say yes, adamantly. I think that no matter what layer you are in an organization, thinking about the visibility, what information you need to know how to do your job, to make decisions, whether it's for your team or a program or the whole organization. These four disciplines are very applicable. Knowing what information you need, knowing how you can make things more predictable, bringing your team in or thinking about who your thought partners are for any decisions that you're making. If you're not even managing a team, you still are making decisions around your work on a day-to-day basis. And what's the space you're creating to step back, reflect, bring other thought partners in, seeding small steps for the future. I think these are all very applicable. So thank you very much for raising that.
That's
To your
great.
point, Simone, I don't know if you want me to answer your question since I didn't, but I do think that there's a lot that was interesting to me at the very beginning when Amy started talking about visibility, that people started jumping in, and it was illustrating that framework we showed at the very beginning, and the fact that sustainability people often think is money, but then and the finances, but then when you ask people like where they need visibility to actually run a resilient organization and think about sustainability, the three things that came up, obviously cash flow and revenue and the finances came up, but also understanding client needs and thinking about funder priorities. The two examples that we then talked about for sort of predictability and understanding where an organization is going. So just really, I thought it was a great illustration of how we're all needing to think much broader to really be sustainable.
Thanks so much for that, Amy. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to add them. A question for a friend. It does, no judgment here. Feel free to ask your questions. I'm just curious. Again, I love those four. Amy Celeb, you talk about the four disciplines. Again, they're visibility, predictability, decision making, and seeding. Other thoughts on those four disciplines, and thinking about this current moment, how folks are entering into today's conversation. I'm just curious if you have other thoughts where you want to go deeper on the four disciplines. Is there one that really stands out for you in this very moment, in addition to what Amy Farley has already shared?
Are you asking Simone? Are you asking us? Or are you asking those who have joined us today?
I'm asking both because yes, this is we're all here to learn. So yes, curious if folks want to just add in the chat if there's one discipline that really stands out. I think some folks have already done that. We would love to hear from you. But I'm curious for you all if there's one that you want to just dig a little bit deeper based off of what you've been seeing in the chat as well.
Yeah.
You know, what's coming up for me, Simone, is sometimes you listen to these frameworks or you get the keywords and the catchphrases, but what we don't talk about is, well, what gets in the way? What are the things that might be holding in place, the ways
Yeah.
that we're already working? And so maybe I'll put you on the spot a little bit, Amy C, or Amy F, if you have thoughts. What are some of the patterns or the dynamics that might actually make it hard, to do these four things or to step into this mental model? I'm curious.
Yeah.
And Amy, someone just said
I-
predictability is the most challenging for me. So maybe we can focus a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. So I can respond maybe to a little bit about predictability, but maybe just step back first and broadly. I think that we get in our own ways at times as leaders, and I'm just going to be honest. So I will just say, I mean, I feel like I had the privilege personally of working with an executive coach at one point in my leadership journey who helped me see that the stories that I was telling myself were kind of ridiculous, some of them, just to be honest. This is me personally, meaning they were a little bit irrational at times or perhaps excuses. And these are disciplines. It's like saying, I'm going to go exercise every day. Guess what? I say that all the time and I don't do it. So what's getting in the way of me exercising every day has a lot to do with me, right? And so I don't want you to feel all the weight of the world on your shoulders, those of you who are listening in today. But I feel like a lot of times it does take examining kind of what is holding, if I am the leader or if I am a leader, maybe you're not the CEO, but you might sit in some kind of leadership position in your organization or management position, like what is holding me back why do I have such a hard time? And really sitting with that for a while. And for me personally, I journal around that at times, and it helps me kind of uncover maybe what's at the root cause of it. And sometimes I have to rewrite the story I tell myself, right, in my head. Like, no, I actually can hold time on my calendar. I can't sit here and keep making excuses about why I'm not doing the thing and I'm not holding the time on my calendar. I need to do it, and I need to communicate to everybody else on my staff. You can't schedule over this block of time because I need it in order to reflect and make thoughtful decisions or whatever it is. So I think that's like writ large, like that's probably the biggest thing. Um, I would say in terms of predictability, um, it's hard for me to say in the abstract what gets in the way there. I think, um, I think it's, because there's so many different areas you could be trying to predict. So maybe really it's like focusing in, and that's why I think we had the reflection questions we did on what are the areas you most need predictability. Like you can't focus on everything. You can't work to create kind of best guesses about everything. So what are the areas where you really, really need it? And then focus in on those. Um, it's like the don't try to boil the ocean philosophy a little bit. Um, one of the things that I will just say, and I know this sounds really simple, but like for me personally, has mattered a lot in terms of predictability is that in our annual budgeting process, we develop a contingency plan. And so when we go through the budget process, we say, okay, what are the things that could happen this year that could derail this budget that I've just put, this plan and this budget I've just put together? And then what are the actions that we will take if these things come true? And it kind of has me, in a way, it's like always doing scenario planning. So we're doing a lot of scenario planning right now because of all the disruption that it's occurring, but there's a way in to do kind of scenario planning all the time, maybe as part of your annual budgeting or planning process. Because that's an area for me personally that helps me feel like I'm going into kind of every year and at every given moment kind of I have a calm about what I'm going to do. Now, granted, sometimes things still happen that I didn't predict, but
I'll also add, Amy, that I think like when I work with organizations, one of the biggest challenges I see people facing is that they feel like they need to be accurate in their predictions and they don't go there because they don't know. And I think that the key for me about it is sometimes in the example you gave, like I have a 25% prediction, like accuracy, or a 50% accuracy, or a 75% accuracy. And even starting to assign that to your options helps you sort of work through those challenges. Like, what's the likelihood? I'm looking at the email. It's sort of saying like we don't work with we don't get direct federal funding. We're dependent on organizations to get it, and so it's hard to predict. Like being able to look at it and say, I have 75% certainty on these things. I have 25% certainty here, and then thinking about what you do about that and how you diversify. But it's a starting point that doesn't make you have to be 100% accurate.
for sure.
Awesome.
There is a question, and I don't know, Carla, Amy, you might have really good answers for this. That's asked about, said they like the question you posed to funders. What's happening inside your foundation right now that might impact our possibility of renewal? And just curious if we had other examples of this like clear, concise questions that help cut through sort of lack of information or funders not sharing everything.
So I, we can only control our own behavior. We can't control somebody else's, such as the funder you may be speaking to. And so I think sometimes you do have to think about what are all the different ways I can ask it and what are all the different strategies that I can employ. But I think step one is to explain why to your funder this information is valuable to you. So think of your own resiliency and sustainability and do your little case making as to like this would really help me to better understand. And I get that you too, sometimes program officers don't have full visibility into what's going to get renewed either because they may not be the one making the final decision. But to acknowledge that and say, I get you too may not know, but even any insights you can give me help me plan so that I can better lead this organization. And so I think the why really matters. Sometimes we forget to articulate the why. I don't know if it's other questions as much as just explaining the why.
Simone, can I
Maybe you have
highlight
other
one more,
questions,
or do
Amy.
we have another minute?
Yeah, no, please
Okay.
jump in. I think we have time for at least 2 or 3 other questions. So please, if
Yeah.
there are
There's
other questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box or the chat.
Yeah, there's two that I think are sort of related. One was saying, how do you help folks think creatively and strategically when what is predictable is persistently reduced revenue? And then we had a question in the Q&A that said, how do you navigate when executive leadership continues to do the thing for the sake of doing the thing when there's no real ROI? And while they're different questions, I think they both speak to needing to think differently, act differently, get out of our boxes, get creative, try new things when it's not working, when the ROI is not there, when we're seeing a continued sort of reduction in revenue. And I know for myself that space, so getting the data and actually like looking at it, but having that space to talk about what we're seeing and the patterns and raising it and having some of the hard conversations is the space where we can name it, and then creating space for reflection and thinking differently is the other one. I think we're all reacting so much and to just what's
Yeah.
coming at us that we don't have the space and the time to step back and say, could we do this differently? What do we need to do differently? And so some of that reflection and space that Amy talked about in that third discipline is really also about identifying new things and then seeding them in four to be willing to try and experiment a little bit.
I think another connection that I would make between those questions, Amy, is about being really clear about what the end game is. So any work that we're doing as mission-driven organizations is a means to an end. And to the extent that we're really clear about what that outcome is, what the impact is we're trying to have, I think it allows us to step back a little bit and say, well, are there other pathways to get there that are lower costs, that are more attuned to, what's happening with our revenue right now? So that's one way in which I think being clear about the end game matters. But also this question about how do you navigate executive leaders doing the thing for the sake of doing the thing when there's no real ROI? Well, is there alignment on what we want that return to look like? Have we talked about what the impact should be? And then do we have some metrics or some indicators that tell us whether we're getting there or not? Otherwise, it's very easy to miss each other in those conversations, or again, to continue just doing a thing, for the sake of doing a thing without any real honest hard, accountability about whether it's making a difference or not.
Yeah. I see a question here from Jessica. I feel running underneath these disciplines are what I call the voices. I think I was talking about those voices earlier because I've had those voices, the nagging self-talks that undermines one's sense of leadership, and how do you counter those? Um, so I I mean, I know it sounds again like simplistic, but they say like even when we're children, like we have to teach our children, or when we have children, we have to teach our children positive self-talk. And let me tell you, as adults, we have to do the same thing. And I think you know, you really, I think, have to have also a discipline to go out and kind of look for reinforcements in your world of those things that you want to, that those like reinforcements. Like if I feel like, well, I'm not a great leader, or I'm not doing this, like whatever the negative self-talk is one might be thinking, it's like try to counter that intentionally and have the discipline to think about when is a time that I, exercised my leadership and I showed that positive, and really trying to intentionally pull out those positives, as well as just coming up with a simple statement. So I often make this joke that I was raised by two therapists, and so they were very big on self-talk. And I remember at one point early in my kind of career, I wasn't kind of in a CEO position, but I was managing people, and I was challenged in managing somebody. And I was talking to my mom about it, and she said to me, she literally said, you need to, and I felt like my boundaries were being, what's the right word? My boundaries were not being respected with this individual. And I remember my mom just said, you need to come up with your one-liner that you tell yourself that gives you that sense of confidence in the moment to respond to this. Like, what is the one-liner that you're going to put in your head? And I remember coming up with that one-liner and I wrote it down. And before I went into the next meeting with that individual, I was like, here's my one-liner that I'm going to tell myself. So I know it sounds kind of simplistic, but where our mind is one of the most helpful and powerful things to us, it's also one of the most destructive at times.
Wow, that's powerful. Our minds are powerful and also can be destructive. Amy Celeb, Carla Taylor, and Amy Farley, thank you all so much for joining us for this amazing conversation today. We see questions still coming in. If you want to just add those, feel free to add them and we can follow up after. And then with that, we are going to go ahead and close our webinar for today, but don't go just yet. We want to just kind of have a moment to just pause. We have 5 minutes left. We're hoping that you have take a couple minutes to do a couple final steps. First, as you consider sustainability and the resilience of your organization, what is one discipline you want to commit to leading first? Of the 4 disciplines, which one will you commit to leading first? That's the first question. And then second, what is one action you'll take this month to put this into practice? Thank you for joining Beyond Survival. Again, a special thank you to our speakers, Amy Celeb, Carla Taylor, and Amy Farley. We will share the link for our recording today, along with a one-pager and notes to capture the insights from today. If you're a nonprofit leader or a funder interested in learning more about how we partner with nonprofits, visit us online at communitywealth.com. Also, we love to hear from you. We want to hear your perspectives so that we can better support you and shape this work moving forward. Please take 2 minutes and we'll drop the survey link here in the chat before you log off to add your thoughts via this survey. Thank you again for joining us today. And in the words of civil rights poet and leader, Maya Angelou, you may not control all events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. I'm going to say it one more time. You may not control all events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. Thank you all again. Please take a moment to complete the survey, and we appreciate you for your time.